is possible, that you could open your camera, please do open it. Kasi virtual na nga, tapos wala pa akong nakikita, puro pangalan. Okay, so it's been a long time. Okay, so this is our first meeting, okay, discussion of our lesson. Basically, we will still discuss first lesson 1, and that is on the nature, on the processes, and elements of communication. Because 2 weeks ago, we were struck by a typhoon, and then last week, there's an activity in the college, right? Local intramurals and other activities, so we're able to meet. So still, this is lesson 1, and we'll be discussing on the on the nature, on the processes and elements of communication. So I would want to start my discussion with a question like, why do we need to communicate? John Manuel. Why do we need to communicate? Or as a human being, why is it important for us to communicate?
To understand each other.
Okay, in order to understand each other. Okay, Donna.
Nakamute ko lang, sorry. So, sir, to create connection with other people, we need to communicate to them.
Okay, so we need to communicate as a form of social interaction because we need to establish relationship and rapport between or among people. Okay, that's right. Yes, Dasalia?
To relay information po.
Okay, we communicate because we want to relay information or because we want to share our thoughts, our ideas, okay, information, opinion, feelings, okay? What else? Yes, Loke.
It's another way to express our feelings.
Okay, or simply communication is a form of expression. Okay, or it's self-expression. Very good. So communication, basically, in terms of its origin or its etymology, it comes from the 2 Latin words. Communis, which means in English, which means common sense, and communicare, which means to share. So what do we share? What do we share in common in communication? So communication means we are sharing common. We are sharing something that is common, something that is mutual, and that is that is simply ideas, information, thoughts, feelings, emotions. Those are the things that we are sharing in the process of communication. Kaya nga, sabi dito, it's common. What we are sharing in communication is something that is common between the sender and the receiver, or between the communicators, that would eventually result into mutual understanding between or among them. Remember that the main goal of communication is mutual understanding. So if we say mutual understanding, that means to say that the sender and the receiver, who are the 2 important persons involved in the communication process, must understand each other, must understand the intended meaning of the message passed on or transmitted by the sender to the receiver. Okay, so it says here, communication, simply, it is defined as it is an ongoing process. So if we say it is an ongoing process, meaning it is a continuous process of sending, receiving, transmitting, and receiving of message between the 2 important persons involved, the sender and the receiver. Now, what is the role of a sender in the communication flow or the communication process? Yes, Donna?
Sender po is the one who encodes the message.
Okay, the sender encodes the message. Sender is also known as the source. Sender is also known as the speaker. Okay, so the sender encodes the message. The sender sends or transmits or transfers the message. And the sender is the source of the idea, which will be converted into message with the process of encoding. Okay? How about the receiver? What is the role or what are the roles of a receiver? Yes, Shereen.
The one who accept the message po.
Okay, so the receiver is the one who accepts the message, the one who receives the message. Aside from that, what else? Yes, Jerlyn.
The receiver is the one who responds to the message.
Okay, the receiver is the one who gives response. And what do we call that response? There is this technical term of response in
Feedback.
communication, the feedback. That's right. So the receiver gives the response, the receiver gives the reply, or technically, we term it as the feedback. Okay? What else? O aside from tinanggap niya, magbigay siya ng feedback, ano pa ang role ni receiver? The receiver also, yes, Rosemary?
Who listen to sender, sir.
Okay, so basically he listens to the sender. So basically if he would be listening and then, ano na? Kung si sender siya ang nag-e-encode, ano naman ang role ni receiver? The receiver, what? Yes, Gerald.
Decode.
The receiver decodes the message. Now, if we say decoding, decoding is the process of interpreting, or it is the process of associating meaning to the message received from the sender. So meaning, kapag yung idea ay i-convert mo, encoding. Yung idea sa, yung mental idea mo ay i-convert mo into message, ang tawag mo doon encoding. Pero kapag yung idea or yung mensahe na natanggap mo ay bibigyan mo na siya ng kahulugan, bibigyan mo siya ng interpretasyon, ang tawag natin doon ay decoding. Okay. Another, communication is nature or it is a natural phenomenon. Okay? Meaning communication is natural for a human being. It is our natural skill or every human, communication is a natural skill of every human being. And lastly, communication is a form of social interaction. Meaning, if you want to build relationships, you want to build friendship, you want to establish rapport among your neighbors, among your fellow, or whoever that person would it be, then communicate. Learn to communicate. Don't you know that according to research, relationships, or there are broken relationships, or the most common reason why relationships are broken, it could be boy-girl relationship, family relationship, or any relationship on that is that lack of communication. Diba nga yung jowa mo, bakit kayo naghiwalay? Ang lagi natin sa, wala na kasi kaming komunikasyon eh. Hindi na kasi kami nag-uusap eh. Therefore, if there is lack of communication or no communication already happening between two or more person, then communication fails. Communication breaks down and relationship also ends. That's why communication is for social interaction. Remember, people, that man is by nature a social animal. We need to socialize because no man is an island. We are not an island. We need others in our life. We need friends. We need relationship. We need our neighbors. We need our family. We need our fellow. And we can only establish relationship and rapport through communication. Now, moving forward, communication is, sabi dito, in simpler sense, communication is about the sending and receiving of the message. Okay? So, definitely, the sender is the one who sends the message, and the receiver is the one who receives, interprets, and gives feedback about the message received from the sender. Another, communication is also the even communication also happens among communicators or among people. It could be in group or it could be more than two. Communication would take place on that. Either in two-way, one-way or two-way. Pag sinasabi nating one-way means linear. Meaning, communication happens linear. Yes, Shireen? Oh, napindot lang siguro. So, communication is...
Sorry, sir,
Communication could be linear, which means it's one way, or it could also be two-way system. But remember that at present, in modern times, communication is already treated as two-way process. Two-way in the sense that it is interactional and it is transactional. Anong ibig sabihin yan? It means that the role of the sender, the role of the receiver may interchange. Pwede silang magpalit ng role sa communication process. Meaning that not at all times the sender is the sender and not at all times the receiver is the receiver. There could be a moment or there could be a time that the sender will also become the receiver and the receiver will also become the sender. So there is an inter-exchange or there is a change of role between sender and of course the receiver. Okay, another. Sabi dito, communication is an intercourse of words, letters, symbols, or messages. That is according to Kunz and Donnell. Which means to say that communication has three types. What are the types of communication? If the communication is in words, that means that it is verbal. If the communication is in the form of letter, that means that is written. And if the communication is in the form of symbols or body movement or facial expressions and the like, you call that one as non-verbal. Oh, let us differentiate. If we say verbal, what do we use? What do we use in verbal communication? We use
Voice.
the power of tongue or we use words, right? We use words in communicating our message. Now, sometimes there are emotions, there are feelings, there are ideas, or there are opinions that we cannot express through words or we cannot express through spoken discourse. And how do we express them? We express them through letters, by writing a story, by writing a love letter, by writing a business correspondence. That is written communication. Another, sometimes if we communicate also, we also use symbols. We also use pictures. We use our body language. We use our gestures. We use our paralanguage. We use our hand movement, our eyes, and so on. And those are that is what we call non-verbal communication. But which is most commonly used? Between verbal and non-verbal, which is more commonly used? Verbal or non-verbal?
Verbal.
Yes, Rodriguez. Why do you say so?
Verbal po, sir.
O bakit verbal?
Because many people use verbal to communicate each other and more speaking about communication. That's
Okay. Who says we use more non-verbal rather than a verbal?
Usually
Not you. Sino yun?
verbal is to using for interview and to communicate
Okay.
some people.
Oh, sige. Good. How about Mark Ivan? Do you agree that we commonly use more our non-verbal rather than a verbal?
Non-verbal po, sir. Because based on my observation, my friends is more on introvert person. So, po, sir, more in introvert po sila. They communicate between chats but they are silent when it comes in person po.
Okay. Sige. Yes, Matthew. Ano? Parang sinasabi mo, actions speak louder than words. Parang ganon. Mhm. Sige. Matthew? How about you? What's your insight? Which is more commonly used, verbal or non-verbal? Oh, why do you say so? Okay. Sige. One last. Casalia.
I do think po nonverbal communication is um, more more used since we perceive people through nonverbal cues, and by that po I think that by that po nonverbal is not used.
Okay. So, sige. Sige, later na yung iba. Okay. So, basically, according to studies or according to research, 70% is non-verbal. If we communicate, 70% is non-verbal, while 30% is only verbal. Why? Because every time we communicate verbally, sumusunod din ang ating mga non-verbal. Right? Pag nagsasalita kasi tayo, automatic, nagmumove ang mata natin, yung mga kamay natin kumukumpas, yung posture natin, and all our body language and gestures and everything, sumusunod sila. Or kino-confirm nila kung ano yung sinasabi natin or sinasalita natin through verbal. That's why they say that non-verbal is more commonly, or it is 70% rather than of our verbal actions. Okay? Or the verbal communication. Okay, another. According to Newman and Summer, sabi naman dito, communication is an exchange of facts. Oh, I highlighted the word exchange of facts. Why? In communication, remember people, that there are 7 important C's of effective communication. There are 7 C's of effective communication. And one of that is concreteness. If we say concreteness, meaning the message that must be transferred by the sender to the receiver must be concrete. And in order for it to become concrete, it must be based from fact. It must be based from evidence. It must be based on truth. It must be real so that it will become concrete. That's why if the message is false, the message is not true, the message is not genuine, the message is not, it's dishonest, definitely that is not communication. Okay? Because, sabi dito, in communication, what must be communicated is fact. Kaya kung nagmamarites ka, hindi yun communication. You are making chismis. You are making sensationalism. You are making yellow journalism about something. You are not communicating. Kasi ang communication, what we transfer, what we transmit, must be fact and must be concrete. And in order for it to become concrete, in order for it to become factual, it must be based on truth. Totoo. Okay? That's one. According to King Solomon, in his proverb found in the Bible, sabi niya, death and life are in the power of the tongue. I repeat, according to King Solomon, in his proverb, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Now, how could you associate this proverb to communication? How could you associate the proverb of King Solomon, death and life are in the power of the tongue, to communication? Oh, sige nga. We are still on number 2. Communication is an exchange of facts. Jimar.
For me, what I understand in King Solomon's proverb, it says that the death and life used by the power of our tongue, because of our choice of words. Uh, like I said, communication is exchange of facts. So it means that every word we said, no, um, we can say that na tawag dito, um, mm, that we use these words to to communicate to other people, or to express it. Yeah, that's all, sir.
Okay, sige, I got your point. We have Gerald.
Ano sir, with every word we speak, it can greatly affect people for good or for worse po.
Okay, so the word we speak, big, or the message, basically, that we give to a person could affect a person, whether it be mentally, emotionally, and so on and so forth. Okay, how about Loke? Yes.
Ano po sir, harsh word can hurt a person more than physical pain. And it is also a emotional pace, and they said that in saying that they taste your own word, people spit them out because you can hurt a person more than you think po.
Okay, so basically, simply, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Simply means that if you want to inspire people, if you want to motivate people, if you want to change people, then use the power of tongue. If you want to ruin the life of person, kung gusto mong sirain ang buhay ng tao, okay, then you can also use the power of tongue. That's why our choice of words, the language, the message, be sure that it should not hurt that person. Sabi nga kanina, physical pain, tama. Physically, if you are hurt physically, if you are wounded physically, maghihilom yan, mawawala yan. But if you are wounded because of harsh words, you are wounded by the demotivating words, definitely that could affect you with all your list, your emotionally, mentally, psychologically, etc., etc. That's why you have to be very careful on how you craft your message. You have to remember that if it could, you have to always remember that if that message could hurt the person or could hurt your receiver, remember that we communicate because of we want to establish mutual understanding. Hindi nagko-communicate tayo dahil hindi tayo mag-away-away. Nagko-communicate tayo dahil dapat mutual, common ang ating understanding of the message passed on by the sender to the receiver. Lastly, according to Allen, sabi dito, communication is understanding the minds of another and it involves a systematic and continuous process. So meaning, communication is continuous, communication is an ongoing process, it's a cyclical process. Now, what ends or what stops communication? What ends or what stops communication? The presence of what? Yes, Donna.
Try lang, sir. Wait lang. Barrier po.
The
Barrier.
barrier. Okay, that could be. But what else? What could be the warning that would tell that communication already ended? Because wala na to eh. Kung wala na to, that means wala na ang communication. Yes, Matthew. The absence of truth in the message. Okay. Yes, Bustero.
If the receiver stop replying or feedback
Okay,
then
very
there
good.
will
If
end.
there is, yes, you are right. If there's no longer or no more feedback coming from the communicator, that means to say that communication ended already. So meaning, yung receiver, wala na siyang feedback, ibig sabihin yun, warning na yun, natapos na ang cycle ng communication. Kasi ang ginagawa kasi natin, for example sa Messenger, wala na nga siyang reply. Diyos ko, chat ka pa ng chat, reply ka naman, waiting for your reply, and so on and so forth. Ang ibig sabihin lamang nun, pag wala ng feedback, communication has ended. Okay? But as long as there would be feedback, then there would be a continuous flow of conversation. But once feedback is absent, and there's no longer feedback coming from the receiver and the sender, for example, then basically communication stops or communication ends. Okay. So we mentioned that communication is simply, it's a process. Okay, communication is a process. It's a continuous process of sending, transmitting, receiving of messages from the sender and of the receiver. But along the way, there could be some hindrances, or there could be some intervenors, or there could be some challenges that could impede the flow of communication. And what do we call those? What do we call anything that interferes the communication?
Barriers, sir.
Communication
We call it
barriers.
as barriers. So meaning communication is a continuous process, is a systematic process of sending, transferring, transmitting, and receiving of message. But along the way, communication process may also be hindered, may also be blocked, may also become unsuccessful because of communication breakdown caused by barriers. Now, before we go on, barriers happen anywhere in the communication process. So before we go on with that, let's have, wrap up of the elements of communication, or perhaps a recapitulation or a review on the different elements of communication. So communication, these are the elements: sender, encoding, message, channel, decoding, receiver, feedback, and of course, barrier. Okay, so elements, number one, we have the source. The source is also known as the sender or the speaker, meaning he is the one who encodes the message, he is the one who sends the message, the one who transfers the message or transmit the message. That's the source, also known as speaker or sender. Another is the message. Message is the idea or the information or the thoughts, the feelings that we want to convey or that we want to transfer to our receiver. Ang tawag natin doon, it's the message. Now, another is what we call encoding. Sabi natin kanina, encoding is the process, or this is an act of assembling the idea into message. So meaning, example, the source has idea on mind. He has a mental idea. Once that mental idea will be converted into a message, that's now what we call encoding. Okay? And another is what we call channel. The channel is where message passes through. It is where message is being delivered. It's responsible for the delivery of the message of the sender to the receiver. So the channel could be our verbal or non-verbal, the use of email, phone call, etc. But the most common channel of communication is our senses. The 5 senses of human being, that is the most common channel of communication. Okay. Another element is what we call the receiver. The receiver is the one who receives, the one who gives understanding, the one who gives interpretation of the message conveyed by the sender. Or simply, the role of the receiver is also to give feedback. Okay? Siya ang nagbibigay ng feedback or ng reply or response. And another role of the receiver is also to decode the message. If we say decoding, ito naman yung process or ito naman yung act of giving meaning or giving understanding or interpretation, or we are associating meaning to the message being passed on by the sender. That's decoding. Pag bibigyan mo na ng meaning or ng kahulugan or ng interpretasyon yung mensahe, decoding naman ang tawag doon sa proseso na yon. And another element, we have what we call the feedback. The feedback, these are of course the reply, or this is of course the responses by the receiver as regards to the message that he received from the sender. And the feedback also, the feedback shows, or the feedback would basically tell whether the communication is effective, successful, not effective, or unsuccessful. Yun. Meaning, if the feedback, if the receiver gives an appropriate feedback intended for the message, that means to say that communication is successful. But if the receiver gives a feedback that is inappropriate or that is not intended to the message being passed on, that means to say that communication fails or communication is unsuccessful. Okay? So sa pamamagitan ng feedback, nalalaman natin doon kung successful yung communication or hindi. Kapag binigyan tayo ng feedback, kung ikaw ang sender at binigyan ka ng receiver mo ng feedback na yun talaga ang gusto mong feedback, that means to say that communication is successful. But if it is the other way around, then communication is unsuccessful. Another is what we call context. If we say context, we are referring to the environment or to the place where communication takes place. Why? Context affects communication. If the environment is very noisy, the environment is rowdy, for example, the physical environment where communication happens, then basically communication also fails. Okay? And another important element of communication that must be eliminated is what we call barrier. So it says in here that barriers, these are anything that interferes the communication process. Meaning, anything that hinders, anything that bars, anything that blocks, anything that challenges the communication, the successful flow of the communication process, ang tawag natin doon ay barrier. Sa madaling salita, Tagalog, sagabal. Yung mga sagabal, bakit hindi nagiging successful yung communication? That's what we call barrier. And the most common barrier of communication is noise. Yung ingay. But noise can also be categorized into two. There are two types of noise. One is the physical noise and the other one is the psychological noise. Now, pag sinasabi nating physical noise means it's the outside noise. Kaya tinawag siyang external. It's the outside noise. For example, the environment is very noisy. Your classmate has a very loud voice. The sound of a jeepney, okay, the horn of a jeepney or a bus, yung of a motorcycle, or the chirping of the bird, for example, those are external noise. Those are physical noise. Those are outside noise. However, if we say psychological noise, these are of course the internal noise. What are examples of psychological noise? One is your mood, your feelings, your attitude, your behavior, your stress, your anxiety. Those are psychological noise. Okay? Minsan, ang tong psychological noise is in the inside. For example, the sender is sending a message, but the receiver is not in the mood. He is in bad mood. He's not feeling well during that day because he has a problem. He's stressed. The tendency would be the receiver may interpret wrongly the message that the sender sent to the receiver. Di ba nga sabi nila lagi, narinig natin, is a cliche. Lokohin na ang lasing, wag lang bagong gising. Because pag bagong gising or paglasing, that could be psychological noise. Or the person is not feeling well during that time. That person is may problema kinakaharap. Naghiwalay sila ng kanyang shota. Hindi pa siya nakaka-move on. Tapos ikaw, may bago kang shota, tapos ikinukwento mo sa kanya gaano kayo kasaya, baka ang interpretasyon niya ay ano, baka maging iba yung kanyang interpretasyon doon sa kwento mo. Kasi nga, meron siyang noise inside, and that is psychological noise. Okay. Now, aside from noise, we also have what we call other barriers, like physical barriers. Physical barriers, these are tangible barriers. Pag sinasabi natin tangible, these are sensible barriers. Naririnig, nakikita, ayan, that's a physical barrier. An example of physical barriers, one, distance. Pag sinasabi natin distance, yung layo ng nag-uusap, ng sender at ng receiver, masyadong malayo sa isa't isa, that could affect the communication. That is physical barrier. Another, we also have what we call your disability or physical disability of a person. The receiver is deaf or the receiver has a speech defect, for example, that could also be a physical barrier and that could affect the communication process. Si receiver, hindi kaya nabigyan ng magandang feedback kasi hindi niya naunawaan. Okay? That's a physical barrier. Another is media deficit. Pag sinasabi nating media deficit, for example, you are sending a message pero bigla kang nawalan ng load or bigla kang nawalan ng internet connection, biglang nawalan ng signal, then that is media myth na tinatawag. Okay? And that's a physical barrier. Another, aside from physical, we also have the cultural barrier. Now, why does cultural barrier occur? Cultural barrier occurs because of differences of culture. Kasi iba-iba kasi tayo ng kultura. Iba-iba kasi tayo ng pananaw. Iba-iba tayo ng beliefs, paniniwala. That's why communication also fails or communication also breaks down. Remember that if we talk about culture, culture refers to our set of beliefs, our norms, our values, our religion, okay? Our opinions, our ideas, our principles, those are culture. Therefore, if the sender and the receiver have differences in terms of culture, or meaning they share different culture, then communication may break down. For example, sa religion, magkaiba kayo ng religion and you will talk about your faith, definitely communication would fail. Walang gustong magpatalo dyan. Okay? That's cultural barrier. Okay, another, language barrier. Now, if we say language barrier refers to, or it occurs because of the differences of language. Differences in terms of wika. For example, the Philippines is a multilingual country. Marami tayong mga dialekto, marami tayong lingwahe na sinasalita. For example, ang sender Bisaya, yung receiver Ilocano, and they do not know the language of one and of each other, definitely communication would break down. That's language barrier. Aside from that, language barrier also happens if in terms of language use. Pag sinasabi nating language use depends on two important things. One, person is spoken to, meaning yung kinakausap, at pangalawa, yung place saan nagaganap ang pag-uusap. That's language use. Meaning, ang language natin ay dapat appropriate or akma doon sa taong kinakausap natin at pangalawa, saan nagaganap ang pag-uusap in order to avoid language barrier. And there are different types of language. We have what we call your slang, right? Yung salitang balbal, or the informal, or the lowest form of language. Salitang kanto, salitang kalye. For example, nakipag-inuman ka sa kanto, alangan namang formal panawika ang gamitin mo doon. Dapat, slang ang gamitin mo, right? Yung salitang kanto, repa pips, topa, yan, pre, yan, those are basically balbal. Another, we also have what we call colloquial. Colloquial is not formal, but it is not so low compared to slang. Okay, that's colloquial. And we also have our dialect, and of course, we also have jargon, and we have what we call the standard language. Ito yung iba't ibang klase ng wika. For example, you are called for an interview, alangan naman islang ang gamitin mo doon sa nag-i-interview sa'yo. Oh, pre, alam mo ba, pre, ang sagot ko dyan, pre, ganito. That would be wrong, right? Definitely, in an interview, it's formal. Therefore, the language to be used must also be formal. Okay, pag pumunta ka sa palengke, bibili ka ng 1 kilong bangus, alangan namang Englishin mo pa yung nagtitinda ng bangus. Right? Oh, ang gamitin mo ay yung language na nakasanayan. Depende sa konteksto. That is language barrier. Another, we have what we call your interpersonal barrier. Interpersonal barrier is the cause of broken relationship. That's interpersonal barrier. Ano itong interpersonal barrier? Hindi kasi maayos yung relasyon mo sa kausap mo. Kaya ang communication nag-fail. For example, you have this feeling of hatred. You have this feeling of anger. You have this feeling of jealousy on the one sending the message. Definitely, you will not give attention to the message being sent to you. Kasi ang nangingibabaw sa'yo ay yung galit mo. Kasi kahit maganda yung sinasabi ng kausap mo, kung meron kang nakatanim na galit dyan sa puso mo, pangit pa rin ang pag-unawa mo. Pangit pa rin ang pagkaintindi mo sa mensahe. Am I right? Yeah, that's interpersonal barrier. It happens most of the time. We don't want to listen because we have this feeling of hatred against that person. That's interpersonal barrier. Another, gender barriers. Gender barriers happen or occurs because men and women and all genders think, behave differently. That's gender barrier. For example, naku, ayoko makinig dyan. Pero sabi niyan, bakla naman yan eh. Diba? Naku, ayoko makinig dyan. Babae lang yan. Tomboy yan. Paano kung maniniwala dyan, eh bakla yan? Yeah. That's basically what we call gender barrier. Okay? So, gender barrier, it occurs or it happens because men and women and all of the gender think and behave differently. We also perceive things differently. Okay? That's gender barrier. Example, yung nanay at tatay mo na nga lang o ikaw na nga lang, di ba? Kapag may problem ka, kanino ka madalas lumalapit? To your mother, right? Because that is the personality of a mother. Pero pag tatay, medyo aloof ka, medyo hindi. Kasi that's not perhaps the nature of men. Another, pag lalabas ka, pupunta ka sa party, magpapaalam ka sa nanay mo, madali lang magpaalam sa nanay, right? Pero pag sinabi ng nanay mo, magpaalam ka sa tatay mo, sabihin mo, naku, wag na lang pumunta. Diba? Because that's basically gender barrier. Yeah. So, if perhaps we parang nagkakaroon tayo ng tinatawag nating stereotyping, pinipili lang natin kung sino yung gusto nating pakinggan, depende sa kanyang gender or depende sa kanyang kasarian. Okay? That's gender barrier. But that shouldn't be the case. Number 6 is emotional barrier. Yung tinatawag din natin itong psychological barrier. Emotional barrier, according to definition, emotional barrier is a mental block. It's a mental block. Yan yung tinatawag nating emotional or psychological barrier. Eh sir, bakit mental block? Eh emotional yan. Perhaps that would be the question, right? Bakit kaya? Kasi mental block because it's the brain that controls all the emotions of a person. The brain is the control center of the human body. So whatever we feel, whatever we feel, whatever would be our feelings, our emotions, etc., that is controlled by our mental capacity or controlled by our brain. Kaya minsan, di ba, pag umiibig tayo, di ba, lagi nilang sinasabi, dapat kung sino ang idinidikta ng utak, yun din dapat ang idinidikta ng puso. Pero, kung iba ang dinidikta ng utak sa dinidikta ng puso, you are confused. Am I right? Emotional barrier results into confusion. Emotional barrier results into misunderstanding, misconception, miscommunication. Kasi kung iba yung sinasabi ng utak mo sa itinitibok ng puso mo, that means to say that there is a hindrance. There is a sagabal. There is something that interferes. And that's basically the barrier. Okay? Yan. Actually, emotional barriers, these are it's a mental block. It could be the feeling of pride, jealousy. Ayan, those are emotional barriers. And lastly, number 7, we have what we call perceptual barriers. Ano naman itong perceptual barriers? Perceptual barriers is simply, it occurs when we give judgment based on how we perceive things without listening to the side of a story. That is a perceptual barrier. Itong perceptual barrier, ito nagbibigay agad tayo ng ating konklusyon, nagbibigay agad tayo ng ating perception na hindi pa natin napapakinggan yung side ng kwento or ng side ng story. Example, may nakita kang kaklase mo, babae, lalaki, kumakain sila sa 7-Eleven. Nakita mo sila, sabihin mo, ay, magsyota siguro sila. Ayan. Or, nagsabay lang naman silang naglalakad sa kalye o sa kanto. Sabihin mo, naku, baka may something sa dalawang to. That's perceptual barrier. Okay? Or, nakita mo yung isang dalaga, napakaikli ng kanyang short, naglalakad sa kalye sa madilim na gabi, madilim na kalye. Sabihin mo, naku, diba? Iba na agad yung perception mo. Iba na agad yung pananaw mo. Or, may nakita kang something that yung mga chika-chika, mga chismis-chismis, may narinig kang mga chismis-chismis, bigla kang nagbigay ng conclusion mo about doon sa tao without listening first to the side of that person. That is perceptual barrier. Okay? Kaya pag nagkwento na siya sa'yo, pinipigilan mo na siya agad. Pinipigilan mo na siyang magsalita pa. Kasi kahit magsalita pa siya, may nabuo ka ng perception sa utak mo. And you call that one as overgeneralization or selective observation. Ang ibig sabihin nun, kasi nga ang tao, pinipili lang natin kung ano yung gusto nating bigyan ng pagpapakahulugan sa mga nakikita and so on and so forth. That's perceptual barrier. Now, these barriers, class, must be eliminated or they must be limited or they must be eradicated in the communication process so that successful communication would happen between the communicators, between or among the communicators. Because if these barriers are not addressed, they are not eradicated, then communication flow would become unsuccessful. Remember that to sum it up, these barriers actually appeal in 3 important levels. What are the 3 levels of barriers? 1 is on the physical level. Physical level, meaning you have this disability, you have the surrounding is very noisy, that's physical level. Another is on our intelligence level, meaning the way we perceive things, the way we rationalize things, the way we give judgment on things, that's intelligence level. And lastly is on the emotional level, meaning how we feel about something. Our emotions, our feelings, that is on emotional level. So meaning, yung physical level, it's very easy to address. For example, maingay, patigilin mo lang yung ingay, okay na. Okay? Because that's a tangible barrier. Ang intelligence level, magbasa ka lang, mag-aral siguro, you expand your knowledge, you can address it. But this emotional level or psychological level is somewhat very difficult to address because of the different experiences, different perceptions, different prior knowledge, different prior experiences of people. Take note that our experiences determines also that our experiences may also be cause of barrier. They may also be barriers why communication fails, why communication breaks down, or why communication is unsuccessful. Okay? Yeah. That's about the nature of communication and its elements and the types, of course. Any question? Question. So your silence is a non-verbal communication. Perhaps that means you understood the lesson. Tama ba ako? Alam, walang sumagot. Any question?
Sir, ano nga po yung noise?
Ayan. Ano yun, Jessica? Ano yung?
Yung noise po.
Noise? There are two types of noise, physical and psychological. Noise is an example. Noise could either be physical or psychological.
Okay.
Kapag yung noise ay loud voices, horn ng jeep, physical noise yon. It will fall under physical barrier. Pero yung noise it's in the inside, like your mood, your attitude, your feeling, that is emotional barrier or psychological barrier. Okay, noise din yon, psychological noise. Okay po?
Okay.
Okay. Any clarifications? None. Okay, can you open your camera for attendance? O, sino yan? Ijuma.
Emotional damage, sir.
Okay. Ready? O, si Sherin. Nasaan ka, Sherin? Sa galaan? 1, 2, 3. One more. Okay. So let's call it a day. Goodbye. And nice seeing you all. See you again on Tuesday. Enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Good night, sir.
Bye,
Thank you, sir.
sir.
Thank you,
Thank you, sir.
I love you, sir.
Bye, sir.